Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
And inspire you to do even greater things.
I'm in conversation with Douglas Ferguson. Douglas is an entrepreneur and human-centered technologist. He's also the president of Voltage Control, a facilitation academy that develops leaders through various programs. In this part of the conversation, Douglas shares his story related to becoming a leader from an individual contributor role and the importance of understanding and empathy in building successful teams. He also talks about teamwork and collaboration and how storytelling can be used effectively in creating a positive culture, as well as related topics such as challenges and opportunities of working with distributed and cross-cultural teams. He talks about the value of rituals and focusing on approaches of generation and exploration to have effective meetings. Listen on. Yeah, hi, Douglas. Welcome to the Software People Stories.
Hey there. Good to be here.
Like we always do, we would like to start with a self-introduction of how you got associated with IT and what has been your career trajectory and what you do these days.
Yeah, I've been interested in technology since I was a very young boy. I was the kind of kid that would take things apart and sometimes successfully put them back together. So I was always curious about how things worked. And I guess I first got exposed to software, writing programs for the Commodore 64 we had at my house. And that planted that seed, I guess, in the curiosity there. And through college, it was interesting. I studied a lot of different stuff during college, and math, biology, chemistry, and some engineering, and wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And then out of college, started just in the startup world. And this was back in the 90s, so things were a little bit different back then. JavaScript was something you generally tried to avoid, and nowadays it's like the most common language out there. And so it was a fun trajectory, but I think probably the most unique thing about my journey is how I maybe leaned into my fascination around how people collaborated and how to create really sustainable teams and groups that could do more than or just get shockingly better results than you might anticipate just by looking at the potential, the power of the group doing amazing things. So I was always really keen to think about different techniques that we were using to make teams more successful. And then I think that's what ultimately that fascination is what led me to start Voltage Control.
Interesting. So when you said that you started out as a programmer, the focus would have been as an individual contributor, or was it more of teamwork even at that time?
No, early on it was I was writing software, so was writing lots of Java code back in the day, and then started managing engineers, and then held a number of CTO positions at different startups. So I started off as an individual contributor, but then I had to make that shift from being really good at what you do to then helping people that are doing what you used to do be successful. Because when you're an individual contributor, it's about you had to bring the answers and figure stuff out. when you become a leader, you gotta put that aside, because if you're constantly the one bringing the answers, then it's gonna be one perspective, and it's also gonna be very limiting for the folks you manage.
So how was that transition for you?
It was at first it was somewhat challenging, because it was a little bit difficult to leave behind all this expertise and the identity that I'd built. Right? So I had to work on that, and I had a mentor tell me once, it's like, you're trying too hard. It's like, just get out of the way and let them do amazing stuff, and use your expertise to make the connections that need to be made. And I think that, plus my fascination with systems, allowed me to say, I'm no longer thinking about the code, the system that we're building there, but thinking about the system we're building with people.
Okay. Yeah, a couple of questions. One of them I'll probably come back a little later. So it's nice that you mentioned that you had a mentor. The role of mentors and how do we pick them and so on. But while it is about teamwork, it's also about building solutions for whoever's going to be using it. So from a technical hat, how do you wear a hat of empathy or hat of understanding what is needed or what problem is to be solved?
Well, I mean, that was something I was very keen on from the very beginning. Is I was never really interested in technology for technology's sake. I had lots of friends that were, dyed-in-the-wool technologists, and so they got really excited about the research and about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But I always felt like it wasn't, innovation is not truly. The difference between innovation and invention is the existence of a market, right? Like, if you can invent anything you want, but if no one cares about it, no one benefits from it, no one wants to pay for it, then it's not truly innovation in my book, right? Like this, you gotta deploy some value for it to be truly innovative. And so I was always kind of tapped into that idea, and that was really important to me. And I think also, as a musician and touring around and performing and observing how audiences might perceive songs, and what compositions they get really excited about, or what kind of stage theatrics will really motivate or get people excited. I think that I had an appreciation and a fascination for these things, even before I started in my kind of professional career out of college. And I think it's super critical, because, a lot of people talk about empathy and having an understanding for the user, and which I think that's a word that can help you somewhat relate to someone else's predicament. But I would argue that, it's not so much we have to empathize with them, but we just have to understand that what we're building has to be of value to them. And if we build something that is so painful to use, that is so difficult to maneuver, let's say our product is used when by mothers who are carrying, infants. So they're going to infant in one hand and they're using our product in the other. If we're not taking that scenario into consideration, then our product is not going to benefit them. It's not going to function properly. And so it's just, I think that word empathy gets thrown around a lot, and sure, it's like, we might want to relate to someone and understand more about them. I think the real trick is that knowledge and that clarity you gain by just considering what they're dealing with and how they're approaching the task that you're trying to solve for, and really let that be some critical design elements for you as you're building out whatever it is you're building, whether it's a service, whether it's a product. I mean, and that just goes for anything, right? Like if we just have an awareness of the situational context around us, we can do anything better, right? Like if I'm playing a song on stage and I can tell people in the crowd aren't into it, then I need to rethink that song or understand the audience better. Similar to like a stand-up comedian, right? If they just go,
Mm.
if a joke bombs 5 times in a row, they might really consider, changing up that joke or setting it aside. And I think that's the kind of mentality that folks need to have. And I think empathy is a word that they've used a lot to try and capture that, um, but I don't know if it truly hits the nail on the head, just because empathy has this like notion that like we've got like we care about them deeply, and it's like, well, I mean, maybe, but like I think the trick is we have to understand them and we have to build from their perspective, because we're creating stuff for them, not just creating a thing and like hoping they'll use it.
Yeah, that's a very nice way of explaining this. Now, the other part is, while you understand, how do you communicate this to the rest of the team members?
Mm. Well, you got to tell stories. I mean, that's the best way to have people really understand or connect with something. You also have to make sure you're aligning with values. Anytime you're trying to help someone understand, relate to, connect with a vision that you have, if you're not appealing to values, it's going to be really hard for them to fall in line or support what you're trying to do. I think it comes back to this whole like concept or rhetoric around getting buy-in, and I think that's flawed language, because getting buy-in sort of already kind of plants the seed that you're selling something, and we don't want to sell stuff to our peers or to our coworkers. We want to enlist them. We want to enroll them into this mission that we're on. And so the way we do that is we appeal to their values. We tell them stories so they can relate and connect in with, what it is that we notice. Oh, 9 out of 10 of our users are carrying an infant in one hand while they're using our product in the other, and even humanizing it down to like, this was Sarah and this is what she was coming home from the grocery store. And, the thing is anytime you can get the specifics around a scenario that comes from telling story, you're going to get more clarity and you're going to get more connection.
Yeah. Now, you've explained it to the team and get their understanding and their support as well. How do you enable that the team works together? I mean, it is kind of nice that you mentioned music as an example, and since you also practice music, this is one question that I always had. At least when we teach music to children, or the way children learn music, there's a lot of observation and repetition and emulation that they do. And by just hearing, even if you're not a trained musician, you can say something is off note or something is not kind of coming together. Do you think there are such approaches, or have you tried or used any such approaches to get the team to work as a coordinated team?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no one recipe for this stuff, right? Like you look at bands, right? You've got bands where there's one songwriter for the whole band. You've got bands where there's like a dynamic duo and the rest of the band kind of just like plays their songs. You got bands where they all collaborate in real time to write the songs. You got some bands that are purely improvisational, right? And then you got mixes in between. Like John Coltrane would bring structures that people would lean on and use, but they were still all communicating in a really fluid and dynamic way. And so I think that the key is that teams need to understand the dynamic that they're working under, and that includes, what's the mission that they're on, and like what are the various capabilities on the team and how the personalities intersect and relate. I think there has to be that understanding, kind of that team charter, if you will, whether that's explicit or implicit. Teams that are struggling can sometimes benefit from sitting down and like mapping some of the stuff out. Teams that are gelling really well probably have a more inherent or intrinsic team charter that they're just operating under because they've already established these norms and they're flowing. I kind of model it as a flow state. Teams can get into a flow state together and they're just humming and going. Sometimes that requires structure and process. Sometimes it requires no structure or process, but it's finding that balance together. And usually that requires a lot of psychological safety, as well as trust, as well as freedom to explore and understand, which is like usually like, built on top of that trust and safety, right? Because if we don't have that, it's hard to do that exploration together. And I think a lot of candor, because if something's not working, we have to be able to talk about that without people feeling they're under attack or something like that.
So how has this played out when teams are distributed, not co-located, as well as some cross-cultural aspects?
I think both
any
of those
stories
things.
that you have to?
Yeah, for sure. So, both of those things are related to this idea of teams getting in the flow and these working norms that they might have to establish together. And so if you're a distributed group and like there's one or two critical folks that really thrive off of being in person, that's going to be challenging, right? But if everyone that's distributed really enjoys and thrives and are in their zone of genius working remotely, then that's a different picture. And so I think, just like any challenge a team might face, that's something that has to be openly discussed and, explored as far as, what are the things that are going to work for us? I'd say that oftentimes distributed teams can function quite well asynchronously, but it's not all distributed teams are working asynchronously. A lot of folks have just kind of following similar patterns that they might have had in the office or whatnot, but they are but they're basically in Zooms. But I think some of the more powerful distributed teams have really leaned into the asynchronous nature of work. But you have to build up norms and rituals and expectations to get into that flow, because that asynchronous flow requires a lot of accountability and a lot of trust, and also just some clear lanes of how things are getting done around setting expectations, sense of ownership, this kind of stuff. Also, it requires a lot of documentation, whether that be like recording videos or writing documentation, creating this kind of like look first culture versus ask first culture, so that then like when you are doing this distributed asynchronous work, like you're still empowered to discover that stuff, figure it out. I would say, the one thing that's the most difficult to replace and replicate is just the random high fives you can just have with someone when they're across the room, and just the serendipity of happening to overhear something and yes and each other in some interesting, powerful ways. But I think that even beyond that, the power of being able to virtually gather around a digital whiteboard or a digital collaboration tool and really get to work on it, I think is potentially outweighs the benefits of some of the serendipity stuff. For voltage control, we still meet at least once a quarter to kind of do planning, do some in-person stuff. And that's really helpful to kind of have these moments of intentional connection where you can go a little bit deeper, perhaps. There's some stuff that flows over into the edges that are just harder to push out into a really long Zoom call. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the same patterns are true, whether it's in person or virtual. And it's about, making sure people are motivated, that they're not overwhelmed, they're just the right amount of complexity of what they're capable of handling, but not so much that they're overwhelmed and they don't know how to even get unstuck, but not so easy that it becomes monotonous and mundane and they're not inspired. And so if they're kind of surfing that sweet spot, that can be powerful. And then also making sure that there's clear ways for folks to work in parallel. So breaking down problems and in ways that allow folks to kind of have some ownership over stuff, divide, conquer, easily integrate. That's the other thing too. Like if we are decomposing problems and allowing people to work in parallel, how are we also making sure that we're having plenty of opportunities to integrate? I mean, just like we have integration platforms for software, so that we're continuously making sure that what you're working on is not blowing up what Susan's working on. I think that we want to take those same techniques into all aspects of what we're doing. So if whether it's a marketing campaign or a pitch deck or whatever.
So are there any, you mentioned rituals or practices that particularly are effective in async ways of working, or things that one should avoid from your experience? And if there are stories, like you said,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for sure. I think recurring meetings with really solid theme and purpose can be really valuable and can also help reduce the need for random ad hoc meetings that maybe probably didn't even need to exist anyway. Really good structure around support and knowledge sharing can really help eliminate some of those ad hoc meetings too. I think the more that you can ritualistically shift away from purely informative meetings to ones that are explorative or generative or decisive, the better. So like going into the meeting saying, hey, what are we generating together? What are we exploring in ways that are, particular or germane to the fact that we're all together? Because we could explore stuff separately, but when we explore together this topic, the new things emerge because we are like yes-anding each other and, and adding on little interesting pieces and then integrating our ideas in real time. But then that's a perfect reason to come together live, whether you're distributed or in person. And so I think that those are some critical moves. I would also say that if folks are creating things together, there's going to be a high likelihood of more success, but better outcomes. If you can actually come together, make a prototype, create an artifact, you can walk out of the meeting and point to stuff. Like, we made these decisions. And what kind of story can you tell about that meeting after you walk out of it?
Yeah. Never thought about recapping a meeting through a story. I think I'll try that next time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in our in our book Magical Meetings, we have this thing we call the Magical Meeting Story Spine, and it's modeled after the Pixar Story Spine, which is the story spine they used to create all the Pixar films. And so it's a fun little Mad Lib that you can fill out that basically helps you tell that meeting story. Now, we didn't imagine people would actually, consistently use that Mad Lib over and over and over again, but it's a nice little training wheel to start getting the habit of like, what is the structure, or what's the archetype of a good meeting story, and how do I learn to tell that?
Yeah, even as I heard it, it does sound very interesting. Yeah, we'll definitely explore that. This is also probably a good segue to talk about what I've known you as in the facilitation space. And first is, what was the entrepreneurial bug that bit you to start voltage control? Or maybe a little bit on what is voltage control for those who don't know.
Yeah.
I asked him about the motivations behind starting the company and the value proposition it offers. The answer to that question and a lot more in the next episode. Don't miss it. I continue my conversation with Douglas Ferguson. Douglas, an entrepreneur and human-centered technologist, is also the president of Voltage Control, a facilitation academy that develops leaders through various programs. In this part of the conversation, Douglas shares his story related to starting Voltage Control and how the academy is focused on developing collaborative leaders. Then talks about the skills needed for facilitation in any role that a person is playing, not just as a facilitator. The importance of emphasizing on diversity, inclusion, and shared values in creating effective communities that can come together and learn together. Touch upon briefly on his experiences in starting and growing Voltage Control as an entrepreneur and the importance of facilitation skills for any effective leader. And finally, he shares career tips for those aspiring to be facilitators. Listen on.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.